all democracies have to begin to see that this is not just about Israel. It's not about just Jews. It really is a threat to the foundations of democracies and a threat to our shared values of life and of liberty. And I don't mean just existential for my people or my country. It is an existential moment for all of us.
Say your name and
Michal Cotler-Wunsh.
So you are Israel's special envoy on anti-Semitism. Tell me a little bit about that role, and also tell me what you did before you came into that role.
So in many, many ways, everything that I did before coming into this role, I think prepared me to hit the ground running when appointed to this role, whether as, sort of international law, human rights expert, whether as an academic researching university spaces and the regulation of speech on university, or whether as legislator in tackling the online anti-Semitism component. In many ways, what 10/7 was the intersection of the many battlefronts that have been raging and that actually fuel and are fueled by anti-Semitism. Having been appointed to this role as Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism just weeks before 10/7, and it should be mentioned that there is a coalition of special envoys for combating anti-Semitism. So there are about 30 of us from countries around the world, the United States, Canada, many of the European countries, the European Parliament, South American countries, which is just testament to the devastating fact that anti-Semitism has been on the rise, increasing in all of those countries and all of those geographies pretty much systematically, and therefore requiring to appoint a person to this role of monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. Israel joined a little bit later in the game. I'm Israel's second special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. And at the critical moment of 10/7, with the brutal removal of all those masks and the many battlefronts in which that war against the state of Israel has been raging, that enabled or fueled anti-Semitism, I think that it is a really incredible, important time to be in this role. And in many ways, the fact that Israel has joined at this moment, at this historic intersection, I think it's an existential moment, actually, not just for the state of Israel, not just for the Jewish people, but the foundations of democracies. Through the lens of this role, I think that there is an intersection that's very important for all of the special envoys combating anti-Semitism, and certainly for Israel's.
So what is your charge? What is the most important aspect of your role?
So had you asked me that before 10/7, I would have responded that the most important aspect of the role is to create a national strategy and unroll it, a national strategy for the state of Israel, not only in identifying and combating anti-Semitism internationally and understanding that the state of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, a prototypical indigenous people who return to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution. The state of Israel has an exceptional role in being able to not only roll out its own national strategy, if you will, but also a national strategy that will work simultaneously with other national strategies. As I was appointed just 3 weeks before the war, in fact, what has happened is a much more of an emergency existential interaction with what I mentioned before are the three battlefronts where this unconventional war for public opinion has been raging to demonize and delegitimize and apply double standards to the state of Israel, the proverbial Jew among the nations. The international institutions, we've seen some of that, the UN, UNRWA, other international organizations, including the International Court of Justice at The Hague, which all of them are actually a manifestation of the co-opting and weaponization of international institutions, of international principles, of international guidelines that were created post-World War II as international rules-based order in order to ensure that never again, when we think about that at this moment of intersection, then of course there is the academic spaces, which in response to the atrocities, to the war crimes, the crimes against humanity perpetrated on 10/7 by an openly declaring genocidal terror organization that is but one proxy of a murderous Islamic regime in Iran that tells us of its intent to perpetrate genocidal attacks of the likes of 10/7, a million 10/7, in the words of their spokesperson. So what we have seen on university campuses is actually this unfathomable backlash attacking Jews in the wake of those atrocities. That is something to be explored. And as I sort of mentioned, I think it does intersect with additional processes that academic spaces have been undergoing with regards to the regulation of speech on university campus. So interestingly or not, the intersection of that with anti-Semitism on campuses has been explosive, including in, as we know, from the hearings in Congress, in the fact that calling for the genocide of Jews on university campuses is not a violation of codes of conduct, or not clearly, or depends on the context. Whereas, and this is the important part, calling for the genocide of any other group, and that would be the question, would not be considered legitimate or would be a violation of codes of conduct. So that is this incredibly challenging moment on university spaces, that rather than see the barbaric atrocities for what they were and actually unequivocally condemn them, which would be a simple task, because rape is not resistance and burning of whole families cannot be justified. In fact, we've seen the opposite in university spaces. What I believe is actually, and I've said this to university presidents, provosts, chancellors, a moment of reckoning for the university spaces themselves, not just to do with anti-Semitism or Jews in their campus. And of course, finally, the digital spaces, which I believe is actually the first time that humanity is experiencing this kind of attack of barbarism on civilization in a reality of digital spaces that in many ways are able to fuel, and not just that, but predict and possibly prevent the real world violence and real world harm that happens online. As a result of all that, that has been sort of the focus of the many meetings that I've had around the world, and of course with Jewish communities around the world, because I mentioned before, as Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, having been appointed to the role of Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, I not only represent the state of Israel, but I am here to serve the Jewish people. And so in many senses, I think that there has been a really, really difficult, maybe moment of awakening, but it doesn't matter. It still is a very difficult moment for Jewish communities around the world, discovering that, well, me too, unless you're a Jew, discovering that we believe you unless you're a Jew, discovering that children's organizations that were committed, or supposed to be committed, to children's rights are enabling, like UNRWA, the not only trampling of children's rights, but the education, inculcation, and indoctrination with anti-Semitic hate, including by thousands of their own teachers who are literally Hamas activists. And that is a real moment of awakening for our people as well. And that has been the nature of the majority of the trips that I've taken abroad as sort of emergency trips, engaging in this role, in this capacity, with a hope that there can still be a return to the original mission and the creation of a holistic strategy, not only vis-a-vis the sort of engagement with the international arena, university campuses and digital spaces, holding to account all of those spaces, but also turning the lens inwards to the state of Israel, that maybe for the first time, as a reflection of this role being quite new, for the first time recognizes and has to recognize its role in identifying and combating anti-Semitism as something that we face together as a people, and being the nation state of that people, defining what that role is.
Do you think that part of the reason there wasn't a real concern about anti-Semitism inside Israel was because the kind of anti-Semitism that's imagined is the kind that comes from Nazis, which we know is like the actual prototypical Nazis are gone, essentially. There aren't very many left. And the kind of anti-Semitism that you have to grapple with here in Israel isn't defined as anti-Semitism, it's defined as terrorism.
So I think you've hit on something very, very important, which the understanding that this unconventional war that is raging is not to do just with what happens to Jews outside of Israel, but in fact has to inform our entire understanding of national security inside of Israel, and that enables us to identify the fuel of anti-Semitism, because the same anti-Semitism that fueled the atrocities of the 10/7 massacre is the anti-Semitism that fuels the responses to the atrocities of the 10/7 massacre. It's the very same mutated, mainstream, modern strain of anti-Semitism, which is anti-Zionism, right? The negation of Israel's very right to exist. And that was made not only very clear in the attack itself, in the location of the attack, where the attacks took place, in the way that the attacks took place. It had nothing to do with peace or with land or with a two-state solution, nothing to do with that. It had to do with our very presence, our very existence right here, wherever we are in this, 1948 conceptualization of a national liberation movement that enabled the return of Jews to Israel. Well, the exact same thing is actually mirrored in the responses to 10/7, right? From the river to the sea, from the north to the south, that actually echoes the Hamas charter, Hamas, a genocidal terror organization that, like Mein Kampf, actually openly states its commitment to annihilating the state of Israel, to murdering Jews worldwide. That is the response that we've seen around the world, including in demonstrations post 10/7. And so one of the masks that was removed, brutally removed, is that the hatred, or the Jew hatred that we face, it didn't die. It just mutated. And while we're looking to find the repeat performance of the form that it took in the past, you mentioned Nazis, that's not how history works. It repeats itself in mutated forms, meaning the prospective commitment of never again post-Holocaust, never again in the future, we can't prevent the past, never again in the future demands that we remember the past, and we just marked International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We remember the past so that we can identify the present threats, and in order to be able to prevent the future recurrence of whatever it is that we are committed to never again to anybody, by the way. And the vehicle that enabled genocide, again, a word that's been, I spoke about the weaponization, the co-opting and weaponization of international law infrastructure, institutions, mechanisms. That is the most Orwellian version of weaponization we are living through right now. The understanding that genocide is enabled by a mechanism, the mechanism of demonization and delegitimization and double standards, whether it's towards the individual Jew, the traditional anti-Semitism that enabled the genocide, the Holocaust, the atrocities of the Holocaust, the individual Jew barred from an equal place in society, or the morphing of the same 3Ds, Natan Sharansky's 3Ds in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It's what makes them so critical. The demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards towards the proverbial Jew among the nations, that is the Jewish nation state, Israel. And that is the critical understanding that I think 10/7 made very, very accessible and clear to anybody who's willing to look into this open casket.
Can you say more about the IRA definition and how it should and shouldn't be used? Because I think some of the pushback against it is the thought that if you define anti-Semitism this way, then it becomes criminal. And my understanding of the use of that definition is that it becomes a way to highlight, to shine light on what is and isn't anti-Semitism, but it also allows for, each country's speech laws to operate appropriately, so that, for example, in the US, where we tolerate a tremendous amount of hate speech, quote-unquote hate speech, hateful speech, that anti-Semitic speech would still be legal. It would still be tolerated in various circumstances. As ironically as the three presidents said, in certain contexts, anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic speech would cross the line and become conduct, but in other contexts it would be allowed. It seems like there's a tension or a misunderstanding about how that definition would be used, and therefore pushback against it because people don't want certain things to be illuminated as anti-Semitism, maybe thinking that that will make it illegal.
So it's very, very important that we clarify the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It's a working definition. The way that I think of it, actually, first of all, it's not legally binding. You can't arrest anybody because they violated the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It's really important to underscore. And the reason that it is a working definition, and it was created to be utilized as a resource, I even would say as an educational resource, whether it's to educate children, university students, DEI officers, police officers, mayors, legislators. In order to be able to identify something, you have to define it first. And in order to be able to combat something, you have to be able to identify it. Now, anti-Semitism, actually the oldest hatred in the world, as Professor Westrich used to call it, the oldest hatred in the world has lasted for thousands of years, for as long as the Jewish people have existed, by mutating, usually according to the guiding social construct of the time, religion, science, and I'll add in our time, the sort of secular religion of human rights or social justice. The implication of that is that it mutates, and you have to be able to identify the new strains alongside the old strains in order to be able to comprehensively identify and combat it. That is just, post-COVID, in a post-COVID reality, we all understand that when viruses mutate, the original strain doesn't die out, or it doesn't disappear. It continues to mutate. And if you don't manage to inoculate your society, your space, your campus against the new strain of an ever mutating virus, it will infect your space, your society, your campus. That's assuming that we want to identify and combat anti-Semitism and not let it run rampant, and understand that it actually predicts many other forms of, I would say, hatred, and the way that they mutate too. It's not just about Jews or about the state of Israel. The understanding that IRA was created as a resource, it is not legally binding. It specifically gives us examples in order to be able to identify the various mutations and permeations of this ever mutating virus, including, and I will add uniquely, the current mutated mainstream strain of anti-Semitism that has presented itself as anti-Zionism, or the negation of Israel's right to exist. And I'll differentiate, the importance of saying, when people say anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism actually targets the identity of the majority of Jews and many non-Jews who self-define as Zionists, whose ancestors for thousands of years longed and prayed and yearned to return to Zion, which is where we currently are. And all Zionists who support the right of the state of Israel to exist, whether they're Jews or non-Jews, are actually barred from the equal and consistent protection, if you will, of whatever infrastructure exists, whether it's at universities as DEI infrastructure or in social media spaces as protected characteristics. If you have excluded or applied the infrastructure that is protecting everybody, you apply it selectively and you say, well, it doesn't apply to David, who happens to be a Jew, or Sally, who happens to self-define as a Zionist, or Fred, who just believes that Israel has a right to exist. What you've done there in that double standard is actually undermine the entire infrastructure.
So let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. You're talking about how people self-identify. And so somebody might say that their primary identity is as a as a member of a racial group, or their sexual orientation, or some other characteristic that is important to them, that is their primary way of identifying. And so you're saying that Zionism is actually an identity category. So that's we're working within a certain paradigm to speak of it that way, right? The existing paradigm. So let's continue to speak about it within this paradigm for a little bit, and then let's come out of that paradigm. But within this paradigm, what you're pointing to is that there are spaces, for example, that are protected for people of different identity groups. There are services that are available to people of different identity groups, and Zionists are barred from those spaces and services. Right?
Yeah, well, we would be remiss if we didn't understand it as part of the sort of decades-long demonization, delegitimization double standard that actually, if you want to sort of pinpoint a highlighted moment. It is the 1975 UN resolution of Zionism as racism, right? Soviet propaganda, 1975, UN resolution, has become sort of commonplace and mainstream on 2024 university campus. And by the way, in the name of progress. Right. What I just said shouldn't even make sense. But Zionism as racism is actually one of the first moments in which this Soviet propaganda actually that turned Zionism into racism, Israel into an apartheid state, and now Israel into a genocidal committer of a Holocaust, each one of them actually a blood libel that builds on the next step of where we've reached, that denies the identity of, by the way, not all Jews, and not and many non-Jews that self-define as Zionists. And we live in a time where people get to self-define, and nobody is able to tell you you cannot self-define with that identity group, except that this identity happens to be one that comes or is directly linked to a heritage and an ancestry to what I believe that Jews are, which is a prototypical indigenous people, right?
So what is the definition of Zionism?
So first of all, the return to Zion that I spoke about, right? The thousands of years of ancestry that Jews carry with them, and not all Jews have to carry it. It's their right to sort of distance.
Stayed here the whole time.
And that's right. So when I say we are Jews or a prototypical indigenous people, and it relates directly to your question about Zionism, that means that for thousands of years, Jews have spoken the same language, Hebrew, and read the same book, the Bible, and traversed the same land, Israel, and practiced the same customs and rituals for thousands of years, denying that part of identity, of which Zionist is but one part, right? You cannot ask me to shed that Zionist pound of flesh and still be the whole person that I am. I am a member of a prototypical indigenous people. For thousands of years, my ancestors, who some of whom lived here, by the way, and some of whom did not, who prayed and yearned and longed to return to Zion. In my case, my grandfather from Iraq, exiled alongside 850,000 refugees from Arab lands and Iran, returned to Zion. And that was, on the rivers of Babylon, that's what we prayed for. That, at the end of the day, and we can get into a whole discussion about how everybody defines that element of it or the other element of it. Zionism is the progressive national liberation movement that enabled the return of that prototypical indigenous people to return to an ancestral homeland based on thousands of years of yearning and longing and prayer. And if we turn it into racism in today's world, that doesn't merit any protection. There's no protection for racists. And if we evolve from Zionism as racism to the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism turned anti-Semitic hate fest, after which the next blood libel was peddled, that is of Israel as an apartheid state, with Israel Apartheid Weeks on every single university campus. We're now at 23 years of graduates that not only think that Zionism is racism, but believe that Israel is an apartheid state. Then it's a small wonder that we arrive at 2024 in the aftermath of the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, and the Orwellian inversion of fact and of law, accusing Israel, while it defends itself from genocidal terror, actually openly telling us that it'll commit that genocidal intent again and again. But when Jews defend themselves in that proverbial Jew among the nations, it is considered genocide. That Orwellian inversion, I think, in many ways informs the conversation that I think that, maybe comes out of that infrastructure that we spoke about before. But it is in many ways what has applied an irrelevant division of the world that I do believe we have to talk about at some point, division of the world between oppressed and oppressor and victim and victimizer. It applies that story to me and to my people. And that is just not our story. That actually is the most troubling part of this, is that in many ways I have been put or imposed upon a story that is not mine. And I have to pick what I am. But none of it, none of the narrative is relevant to the story of the Jewish people. And that's where it sort of takes us out of the paradigm that you were referring to, I think.
That's a perfect segue. Right, that paradigm that on college campuses and in human resource offices divides people into identity categories and then defines them as either oppressed or oppressor, that isn't the Jewish story. So what is the Jewish story?
So in many ways, and I think that this is a moment of reclaiming the Jewish story, including for us, the Jewish people, in understanding at this historic intersection that perhaps for the first time, Jews do not have to put down their heads when a tsunami of Jew hatred washes over us. For the first time, certainly in memorable history, but maybe for the first time ever, we're in this unique intersection where we have a homeland, we have sovereignty, we have a defense force, so that when we say never again, we mean never again are we going to wait for anybody to come and save us. And on the other hand, with half of us here and the other half of us in the rest of the world, in this retelling of the shared story, because we successfully in this shared project built the first tier, the first level of this shared project. That is the miracle that is the 75-year young state of Israel. But we're not done telling the story. I believe that we are writing the next chapter, and in many ways, 10/7 among the masks that were removed on 10/7 is a mask removed for us, is as a call to action, if you will, for writing this next chapter of what it means to build the next level or the next tier of this shared project, of this miraculous return of an indigenous people to an ancestral homeland after millennia of exile and persecution committed to equality. And that's not me saying, that's Israel's Declaration of Independence. That's Ben-Gurion's prophetic text that actually is a call to action for our generation, wherever we live, in Israel and around the world, to engage in this post-10/7 reality that removed the mask that says to us as well, what is our story? And to reach back into the understanding of why we returned to this specific place with Zionism as that progressive national liberation movement, and what it means for us today as a reclamation of identity wherever we live. That's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is vis-a-vis our allies around the world, and I believe we have many. The understanding that no matter what countries we live in, the integration of Jews over time has come to this halt, if you will, where people have had to lose friends, not because they've done anything wrong, but because their people was attacked on 10/7, is a real moment of reckoning in those countries, I would say in particular in democracies. Because 10/7, the barbarism of 10/7, the mask that it exposed, I think, is not, and the reason that I call it 10/7 is of course to refer to 9/11. It makes clear that it is not just about the state of Israel or about Jews around the world that are being attacked in a tsunami of anti-Semitism as a response to the massacre on 10/7. It is an affront to our shared humanity and to civilization itself. It is the sheer barbarism, as I said, of that day, the rape and the burning of whole families and of babies and the abduction and the mutilation and the murder. That is not progress. That can't pass in the name of progress. And there are many people across progressive spaces that have adopted a narrative that has to be questioned. And I believe that there is a moment of opportunity that we have to identify and transcend and reach across real and perceived difference of religion, of geography, of politics, of denomination, because there is a shared understanding amongst people that saw the atrocities of 10/7 and then saw the responses that are waving signs that say, we are Hamas. That's akin to waving up signs post 9/11 that say, we are Al-Qaeda, we are ISIS. From the river to the sea, from the north to the south, as I said, that is projected on George Washington University's library, and glory to our martyrs, that echoes the Hamas charter. Hamas is a genocidal terror organization, but one proxy of a murderous regime in Iran. This is a much bigger moment than an attack of Jews. And if you will, it's one of those moments in history, and we've said this, in several sort of reiterations of it, that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. that we may be the bloody canary in the mine shaft, but the mine shaft will collapse. And in that sense, I think that 10/7 is not just a moment of crisis, but a moment of opportunity and responsibility to reach across and create allies that we have and enable the reclamation, not just of our identity or our indigeneity, which has been stripped from us, not just of Zionism as the progressive national liberation movement integral to the identity of the majority of Jews and many non-Jews, not just of, in fact, what apartheid actually was, and not minimize it to equate it with what is illegitimately being placed on, to reclaim what the Holocaust was and its memory, and what genocide, a term coined by Raphael Lemkin to describe the worst atrocities one could imagine that had no term to be able to describe, atrocities too terrible to imagine, but not too terrible to have happened, on the, as I said in an Orwellian inversion of fact and law, on the 75th anniversary of the Convention for the Prevention of the and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, for that to be in the International Court of Justice and actually entertained, submitted by none other than South Africa, where the
original apartheid state.
The original apartheid state where the Durban Conference Against Racism took place, turned into an anti-Semitic hate fest, even as it meets with Hamas leadership and hosts leaders of Sudan actually perpetrating a genocide in Darfur as we speak. The Orwellian inversions are just too many to ignore. And in that sense, what we have to make accessible is, again, that issue of double standards that collapse the entire infrastructure. The ICJ, the UN, other women's organizations, the international women's organizations that have been silent, children's organizations that have been silent. When you apply any rules selectively, you undermine it, and it can no longer protect anybody. And that is one of the most important takeaways, not only from 10/7, but from the responses to it.
Let's touch on two things. One is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which just happened on January 27th, during which at least two leaders, one the head of the UN, and one, I think, the head of Ireland, managed to say something about the Holocaust without mentioning Jews. So that's one thing I'd like you to talk about, and then the other is UNRWA. Some things just came to light about UNRWA. So let's start with International Holocaust Day. What's your take on, speaking of Orwellian, what is your take on that?
So I actually think that it's one of the most alarming manifestations of what I was referring to, and the co-opting and weaponization of historical facts, of principles, of mechanisms that were created in order to ensure that never again to anyone. I should say this isn't just about the Holocaust, the genocide perpetrated against Jews. Genocide through time, if you look at the mechanism that enabled them, it is those 3 Ds that are so important, making IRA so critical. The demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standard enabled the genocide in Rwanda, enabled the genocide in Bosnia. It's an entire process. It doesn't happen overnight. And the understanding that the Holocaust would be utilized in a way to erase Jews from the Holocaust actually is an affront to the lessons of never again. It means that it can happen again and again, right? If you don't note the mechanism of actually understanding anti-Semitism, and that's what fueled Jew hatred, is what fueled the final solution, and we just marked 82 years to the Wannsee Conference. The final solution that the Nazis, we referred to them before, that the Nazis committed to is the same final solution that genocidal terror organizations and their leadership is now telling us that they're committed to. That is the final solution that they're committed to. If we're not going to recognize the mechanism, then the words never again have no meaning. And it concerns me very much that though we continue to have Holocaust curriculum without Jews and without the Jew hatred that fueled the atrocities of the Holocaust means that we are failing at teaching precisely what never again is supposed to do, never again in the future, because we cannot prevent the past. The mechanism that enabled the atrocities of the Holocaust in the past were that process of demonization, delegitimization, double standards, and if you against the Jews, a very particular group of people. And the same particular group of people is now targeted with the same kind of final solution. By the way, if you even listen to the chants, including those that were just in Stanford, in my recent appearance in Stanford, yelled outside of the lecture hall, there is only one solution, Intifada revolution. There is a reason for the specific words that are being used. There is a reason that Mein Kampf was found in Arabic all over Gaza as in this war that Israel is fighting at the moment. And if we're not going to be able to connect the dots with all of the masks that were removed, brutally removed, then we are doomed to repeat history. And as I said, I think that the most Orwellian co-opting and weaponization of history and of terminology and of words are happening right now with Holocaust and with genocide. And I'll say one more thing. I keep mentioning the 3 Ds, but there's another D that I would add to this, and it is denial. It took decades for there to be Holocaust denial, although there were some that, denied immediately. But for it to become a mainstream, legitimate sort of ideology, denial of the Holocaust, it took hours, even as genocidal, barbaric savages were live streaming the atrocities of 10/7, denial began to kick in. And I think that's a little bit to do with the social media reality in which this is happening. And the understanding that denial actually is probably the warning sign or the siren that tells us that we are about to repeat history, because denial enables us to forget everything that we were supposed to learn in that never again prospect of commitment. Enabling the other 3 Ds is this moment that I think, with regards to Holocaust education, is very alarming.
Well, one of the things that I noticed on Twitter, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, was this declaration that the Holocaust wasn't just about the Jews, that the Holocaust, that the word doesn't refer to the Holocaust. That is what the Holocaust is about, what happened to the Jews in World War II. That's what the word was created for. And there's now this idea that the word means essentially something bad happening to any group, or maybe is interchangeable with genocide, or some complete misrepresentation and misunderstanding of what the word means was all over social media. That was fairly shocking to me.
You're actually just highlighting again why the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism is so critical. Because one of its examples is Holocaust denial, minimization of the Holocaust, or the complete ability to, change the meaning of what it is that the Holocaust was. And the reason that the IRA is so important, and actually for online spaces too, and in my engagement as legislator, forming an interparliamentary task force to combat online anti-Semitism, what we asked the social media platforms to do, and actually in the last engagement, you were hearing that we held, the demand was actually just for transparency of the algorithm, transparency of the policy, and transparency of the implementation of a policy, because the understanding that that is allowed to run rampant, and we understand full well that what happens online doesn't remain online, has very real world implications, including real world violence and real world harm, and that there is a global element to it. And if we don't have that transparency, we don't even know where that comes from, right? Who is disseminating this kind of disinformation or misinformation, whatever we like to call it. And therefore, I don't want the social media platforms regulating what is or isn't. I don't want them censoring or allowing. What I do expect is transparency to understand what it is that they're using to algorithmically detect what they remove and what they allow to remain online, and who they remove and who they allow to remain online. The transparency is being very key, and the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism in that space too, as an informing mechanism that enables to, if you are committed, for example, some of the social media platforms committed to combating Holocaust denial, well, they're not doing a very good job, are they? Even if they are committed to combating it, and I would like to know that. right? What is the policy and how is the implementation of the policy going? The most alarming part of erasure of Jews from the memory of the Holocaust, the most alarming part, is that it actually paves the path for the legitimization, as we see, of the murder of Jews. And the legitimization of the murder of any group should actually really serve as a moment of awakening for all groups that expect, or all minorities that expect that never again principle to apply to them. I think it's a very alarming manifestation of what we've seen post 10/7, and actually an indication of how deep that process of anti-Semitism as a mutating virus has really permeated the many structures of society, including university spaces, including other spaces as well.
That actually makes me think of Paul Kessler.
Yeah. Say his name.
Exactly. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get back to UNRWA.
So the understanding that, we mentioned it a couple of times, but that in response to those atrocities, instead of it being a clear, unequivocal condemnation, because who can explain what it is that we saw on 10/7?
And certainly who would celebrate it?
And or be exhilarated by it in some universities, or enabled to say that resistance is justified and that is a form of resistance, meaning it was so grotesque that I think that that's part of the understanding, that it enables us to see that this is something much, much deeper and very, very systemic, and perhaps a result of something very systematic, right? So Paul Kessler, and for me, the fact that nobody remembers his name, and I really try and remind all of us that Paul Kessler was murdered in a demonstration in the United States of America. And that's what he was. He didn't walk into a megaphone. Meaning, we can say a lot of things, but the fact that, say his name, Paul Kessler, a Jew in the United States, holding an Israeli flag in support of a war that is raging in Israel, an existential moment in his people's history, and that nobody remembers who Paul Kessler was. That, to me, is actually a moment of reckoning for the United States. The understanding that some people count more than other people, and that Paul Kessler has been forgotten, to me, should devastate the United States. And in fact, create opportunities for a real, deep conversation on how that can be. Now, this is the thing about anti-Semitism, which sort of intersects with a lot of what we're saying. The thing about anti-Semitism or Jew hatred over time is we were hated for who we are and who we aren't. So according to the alt-right, Jews will not replace us. We can never be white enough. And according to the radical left, we are super white. And in that intersection, Paul Kessler gets forgotten. And as I said before, not only is it not our story because Jews are not white or prototypical indigenous people, Paul Kessler gets forgotten no matter what it was that he was doing in that demonstration.
This was in Los Angeles.
It was in Los Angeles, indeed. And in many ways, the fact that we sort of haven't heard his name and it hasn't been a moment of reckoning is probably the most troubling for me, and maybe that connects to UNRWA. The thing about UNRWA, first of all, is that it was born in sin, right? UNRWA is the ultimate mirror of the double standards that I referred to before with regards to the state of Israel, is of double standards with regard to refugees, in this case Palestinian refugees. There is no other group of refugees that is granted refugee status in perpetuity, forever.
And their descendants.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. Forever and ever, handed down in perpetuity from generation to generation. Their descendants were now fifth generation, and there's no limit. There have been and were post-World War II many groups of refugees. I mentioned one of them, 850,000 Jews from Arab lands in Iran, all refugees for that one generation. I'm not a refugee. And imagine that understanding that for one group of people in the world and what it does to them and to their psychology of being able to, instead of holding on to the past, being able to create a future. If you are a refugee forever, even if you've never been to the country of which your great-grandparents were refugees from, then you have no chance of actually looking and creating a better future for your grandchildren. It has prevented generations of Palestinians from looking to the future instead of looking to the past. So not only was it created in sin, singling out one group of refugees, pouring billions of dollars in order to perpetuate a conflict in one area of the world that happens to be here in the state of Israel, in the Jew among the nations. But what we have for the last 20 years, we've been trying to make accessible and make aware democratic countries that are funding those billions, tax dollars in democracies that would never inculcate, indoctrinate, teach the curriculum that's being taught by UNRWA schools, enable the participation in the 10/7 massacre by at least hundreds, and we now know to say thousands of teachers celebrating the 10/7 massacre. Teachers, what I say, we should be shuddering. Teachers, educators, doctors that held hostages in their homes, teachers that held hostages in their homes, all under the UNRWA umbrella, being subsidized by democratic countries with tax-paying dollars of people who would never, ever support that kind of hate in their own countries. Never, ever imagine that the United States or Canada or Germany or the many other countries that have decided to freeze their funding, and I hope that this means a turning point for UNRWA, because freezing funding is insufficient, because the understanding that the need to dismantle UNRWA, which has served as the long arm, if not an actual arm, of Hamas, now that we absolutely can't ignore it, under whose hospitals, schools, mosques, watchful eye, hundreds of miles of terror tunnels and dungeons were built over the last, at least since 2007, since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip.
Using the humanitarian aid that UNRWA was supposed to oversee.
Precisely. Not only using that humanitarian aid, but denying it of the Palestinian population that were supposed to be receiving it. Just like we saw in post-10/7 with Hamas actually hijacking humanitarian aid from those that were supposedly or supposed to be the recipients of it, because, and we have to understand this, terror does not respect the rules of engagement between democracies or between individuals. The opposite. Terror seeks to sow fear, distrust, and despair. And every time that we enable it to sow fear, distrust, and despair, we empower its success. And to think that democratic countries, well-meaning, would enable, empower, and continue and grow this terrorist infrastructure in the form of Hamas that not only targets Israeli civilians, as it did on 10/7, that not only in its charter seeks to annihilate the state of Israel and murder Jews, but that holds Palestinians as human shields, as human sacrifices, and thrives from that. To think that democratic countries would enable that is a moment of reckoning for democracy. And as I said, Hamas is but one proxy of a murderous Islamic regime that does the very same thing to its own people, abducts, poisons, executes, just yesterday, 4 more. The understanding that Iran is engaging in a war by proxy, by the way, on all of Israel's borders, the Houthis from the Red Sea and Hezbollah from the north, and Hamas we've heard of in the 10/7 attack, in all of Israel's borders, but Iran has no intention of stopping with Israel. We may be on the front lines, as I said, as the proverbial canary in the mine shaft. And we are on the front lines, in fact, but we are on the front lines of civilization. And Iran actually, the good thing about authoritarian regimes is that they say what they mean and they mean what they say. You can just, because Twitter hasn't, or X hasn't adopted the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, you can just check the Supreme Leader's X account and see days before 10/7 and since 10/7 how, interchanging Jew with Zionist, he calls regularly for the annihilation of the small devil, the Zionist cancer that is Israel, and then the destruction of the big devil that is the United States of America. And unfathomably, that is what I was told on Stanford's campus too, just last week, right? We are going to make sure, the generation that's here is going to make sure to destroy Israel and then destroy the United States. I can share that with you if you'd like to see it, right there on Stanford's campus. Those declarations make accessible what it is that I think all democracies have to begin to see, that this is not just about Israel. It's not about just Jews in their countries that are being attacked in the wake of 10/7. It really is a threat to the foundations of democracies and a threat to our shared values of life and of liberty. And a part of what has actually energized me to keep going across the ocean is to try and make the existential nature of this moment, and I don't mean just existential for my people or my country, the existential nature of this moment for all of us who cherish those foundational principles of life and of liberty that democracies have afforded us. It is an existential moment for all of us. And the amazing thing is, when I think about this, that there are many more of us that cherish civilization than those of us that want to destroy civilization as we know it. The only thing is that we're holding on for dear life to the differentiations of yesterday, between right and left, between religious and secular, between Jew and non-Jew, between geographies. And the truth is that 10-7, if we're looking, gives us an opportunity to see very well that what is at threat is what we share. Our shared foundational principles are being threatened. That includes the weaponization, as I've said, of the very infrastructures that were created to uphold, promote, and protect these foundational principles and ensure they're applied equally and consistently so that the infrastructure remains. The UN and UNRWA and the ICJ, their weaponization is very dangerous, very detrimental to all peoples, not just to my people. But it's also very dangerous to the civilizations and the spaces that enable anti-Semitism to fester and to continue permeating now. And it's dangerous not just for Jews on campus. If there is a call on university campus for the destruction of the state of Israel, of the United States of America, not just the state of Israel, then that is a challenge for the United States of America as much as it is for the state of Israel.
I think you're sort of pointing to something that might be a foreshadowing that Israel didn't really pay any attention to these, campus chants, this has been going on for a long time. It didn't start on October 7th. The vehemence and the exhilaration started on October 8th or so, seeing that something had actually happened. But I think before that, most people who heard these chants downplayed them, didn't think it meant anything, and thought if they saw what would really happen, they would change their mind. And the fact that it didn't, that 10-7 didn't change people's minds on campus, that was probably what was most shocking. But I think nobody really takes seriously the idea that anybody who chants these things wants to literally dismantle the United States. That sounds like catastrophizing, to use, cognitive behavioral therapy language. And yet it sounded like catastrophizing to say that from the river to the sea chanting was something that meant the destruction of Israel. And now we see that people are truly articulating, even on college campuses, a desire to eradicate the state of Israel. Is it impossible to communicate this in a way that doesn't sound hysterical?
So, look, when you look at what happened on 10-7, and I don't want to be graphic over and over again, but the burning of entire families and the raping of women so badly that their legs can't be straightened for burial, and mutilation of dead bodies and necrophilia.
Mutilation of live people.
Mutilation of live people, and their burning to death while they're alive, and their murder and their abduction, which, by the way, in the language of international law, their abduction is actually a standing violation of international law. Every second of every hour of every day of every month that those people are held in captivity is another a violation of international law, is another war crime. We have to understand that that was intentional. When you look at that and you don't feel catastrophe, then I have a hard time, sort of making accessible what catastrophe means. What I do think is a challenge is that there are many people who look at that and say a couple of things, and here I can't but think of Emmett Till's mother, who makes the decision of burying Emmett in an open casket. And she makes the choice, and a very difficult choice, because she knows she's going to cause trauma to to her own kids, to her own community, to the, to everybody in church that's looking into the open casket. But she makes that very brave decision. And she makes it knowing that people will look in and see themselves and understand and be called to act in order to ensure that never again, right? What concerns me is that although the State of Israel opened up the casket and we saw the silence of the women's organizations and the silence of the children's organizations and the silence of the international institutions that should have been calling on each of the 14,000 rockets, each a double war crime, targeting Israeli civilians in their beds from densely populated areas in Gaza, and the silence and the impunity actually, to me, suggests that maybe we opened up the casket, but when the person or the country or the campus that looks into the casket looks in, if they look in, they don't see themselves. If they look in, and more likely, they don't even bother looking in, because the demonization and the delegitimization and the double standards of the Jew or the Jewish nation state that just replaces the individual Jew says, A, it's not me. B, that's not a real person. That's why I can tear down posters of hostages of 10-month-old turn 1-year-old babies in the hell of the underground tunnels of Gaza. And finally, the double standard. Well, even if it is the Jew, it's just the Jew. And that is what concerns me the most about this moment of time when you say that it can be perceived as catastrophizing, because what happened was a catastrophe, not a microaggression, not a micro-catastrophe, a catastrophe. And if those very students that are so inclined to complain about a microaggression can see, or a micro-catastrophe, can see a catastrophe for what it is, then maybe that takes me back to the moment of reckoning, not just for the university spaces, but for the societies that have bred individuals that look at an actual catastrophe and don't see it as a catastrophe, or don't see themselves as part of the target of that catastrophe, or even worse, are exhilarated by the catastrophe and think, I'm on the right side of history. I'm going to perpetrate the catastrophe when it comes this way. That to me is really a huge red alert siren that I keep traveling across the ocean to try and sound and say, again, we are on the front lines, but we are on the front lines historically as a people. Where there was social mobility, Jews thrived. Where social mobility ceased to exist for Jews, and social mobility can also be for a country, right? You have to have social mobility. You're equal. You're equal to everybody else. You're not better, but you're not worse. And the understanding that social mobility is at a very critical moment, including in the United States, so that, for example, I have students saying to me very often in my talks, I've decided to come out. And when I ask, come out as what? It is, come out as a Zionist. Because they understand that they run the risk of social exclusion or bad marks or maybe not getting a job. That means that social mobility that has existed in the United States, because the United States, like Israel, is an idea. But we are at a war of ideas. That's what this is. We are in the midst of a raging war of ideas that Israel represents, that the United States represents, that democracy represents. But the war is not just on Israel, it's on the idea. And maybe there are some, including in our own geographies, that actually espouse to the idea that is warring against the idea of democracies or of human dignity and life and liberty. I am in many ways driven by that, by the understanding that because the existential nature of this war is very tangible in Israel right now, the catastrophe is very clear, not just where these atrocities were perpetrated. It has to be clear that there is not one person in this country that has not been implicated, whether in the Nova Peace Festival losing a loved one, whether in Be'eri and in Nachal Oz and in Sderot having people burned in their beds, in their homes, raped, or in the war of self-defense, having lost those of us that have kids in the army and friends' kids in the army and kids' friends in the army. Every single family, every single individual walking around Israel right now has been impacted by this war. So the existential feeling, including, of course, sirens that can continue raging, including all over Israel and including yesterday right here in Tel Aviv. The understanding that existential threat is a feeling is something that drives me to keep traveling across the ocean to say, you have to understand that the existential feeling, though you may not hear red alert sirens here, this existential challenge, it's not just ours. And it is a much more difficult, elusive challenge or threat to understand when there's no red alert sirens or when you're not on the front lines of it. I think that that's part of our role and our responsibility. And historically, I'll say again, the Jewish people have always had a very good predictive ability, or a litmus test, if you will, for the societies which ceased to allow them to have social mobility. It's usually the beginning of something very bad for those societies or those spaces. And I believe that we're at a moment exactly like that.
Well, on that happy note, I think we'll conclude this interview. But thank you very, very much, Nick, for the work that you're doing. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. And I'll just maybe end with one final thought so that it doesn't end on that note, with the thought of hope, in quoting the late Rabbi Sachs, who differentiated between optimism and hope, telling us that optimism is the belief that everything will be okay, whereas hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. So in that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, and hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. And I remind us that our national anthem is Hatikva, and hope is what kept the Jewish people for thousands of years and will keep the Jewish people for thousands of years to come.
Thank you. That's a much better way to end. I appreciate that.
Thank you.